Hey everyone, welcome back for my May wrap-up. So during the month of May, I read quite a bit, a lot more than I thought I would, so let's just dive in. The first book that I read was Addicted to You by Krista and Becca Ritchie. This follows two best friends who've been best friends for a very long time. Lauren has been addicted to alcohol, and Lily is addicted to sex, so they fake a relationship in order to hide their addictions from their family and sort of enable each other. I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. I did enjoy the story. I thought the characters were great. The writing between both authors blends seamlessly. I really wish this book would have been dual point of view. I think the story would have been so much better if we would have seen from Lauren and Lily's perspective and not just Lily's, because it sort of solidifies Lauren's addiction to alcohol and how bad it is. We understand through Lily's perspective that she is addicted to sex and it is sort of destroying her life, and we only see like the secondhand account of how alcohol is destroying Lauren's life, and I really think that a dual perspective would have really made this book much better. The second book that I read was World After by Susan E. This is the second book in the Penryn and the End of Days trilogy. I reread this in preparation for End of Days, and I'm giving this a 5 out of 5 stars. All you need to know is that we have a main character who is a badass. Penryn is probably one of my favorite young adult main protagonists. So if you've never read this, you are sorely behind and have to read it, because honestly, it's probably going to be one of the best trilogies I've ever read. The first trade paperback of the month that I read was volume 19 of The Walking Dead March to War. What I will say is I think I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars only because this entire novel is pretty much set up for the next arc. March to War is kind of obvious is what's going to happen next. There are some things that happen in this that aren't really related to the next arc, so that's why I ended up giving it a 4 and not something lower. I still am really enjoying this comic series, and if you've watched the show and are kind of leery about starting the comics because you don't really want to read the same thing over and over again, this is completely different from the show, and I would definitely recommend reading them. They're fantastic. The next book that I read was One More Chance by Abby Glines. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. This is the second book in the Chance duology, but it's also like the 7th or 8th book, I can't remember, in the Rosemary Beach series. This follows Harlow and Grant. I went into this book with very low expectations because the first book I really didn't like. I thought Grant and Harlow were awful characters. They were boring, they were annoying, their relationship was just stereotypical and boring. The second book, One More Chance, really steps it up, and I actually really enjoyed where their story went, although I wish the author would have taken the ending in a different direction, but it was still pretty good. After that, I picked up Eleanor Park by Rainbow Rowell, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I honestly can't believe it took me this long to read this book because it is absolutely phenomenal. Rainbow Rowell is amazing, and I understand why everyone loves her so much because she's such a fantastic writer, and she understands her characters and she creates these beautiful stories. It was absolutely amazing. I am definitely going to read the rest of Rainbow Rowell's work because this just sort of sealed the deal for Rainbow Rowell for me. After that, I reread Never Never by Colleen Hoover and Taryn Fisher in preparation for part 2. I gave them both 5 out of 5 stars. They were fantastic. I actually enjoy getting little snippets of the story like this in novella form. I think it's exciting, but it's also frustrating because I want the entire story. But I think it's fantastic. I can't wait to see where this story goes, and the second part was just as good, if not better, than the first part. The next book that I read was Killing Ruby Rose by Jeffrey Humphreys. And by read, I mean I didn't finish it around 50% of the book. This book is described as a Veronica Mars-esque book because we have a teenager who is sort of like a PI, and she's chasing down and hunting down all these like serial killers and rapists and stuff. And then she gets pulled into this other plot, and then the story kind of takes off from there. And I didn't finish this around 50% because the plot gets incredibly convoluted and just ridiculous. From almost like the first 50 pages, she's pulled into like this crazy like action sequence, and then there's another action sequence right around the corner, and it just gets incredibly confusing and annoying. Like, there is such thing as too much action in books, and especially when that action is incredibly unrealistic, and it makes it very hard to enjoy reading. The writing style is juvenile at best, to be honest. I really just was incredibly disappointed with this book. I felt like I couldn't waste any more of my time reading it because it was a very disappointing book. Next up, I read The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars, and the reason I really picked up this book is because it was compared to Gone Girl, and I loved Gone Girl. So kind of had high expectations going into this because of the comparison, which you should definitely not go into this book with any sort of expectations for it to be like Gone Girl, because despite it being almost in the same genre, they're very different stories, and the authors took very different ways of telling their stories and introducing the characters, and their characters are just completely different. I still really enjoyed the story. The reason I gave it 4 stars is because I thought the ending was a little bit rushed. But the author does a fantastic job of giving you this sense that you can trust the main character, and then you find out things that she omitted when she was, sort of just thinking about past events, and you realize she wasn't thinking of the whole story, so she sort of becomes like almost like an unreliable narrator. It was still really a very interesting ride. It kept me hooked. The one thing I will say that it is a slower paced book, and that pace works for this kind of story, but if you do not like slower paced books, then you will have a very hard time getting into this.